We're coming close to the mid-morning, and you've heard a whole lot about all sorts of abuses, all sorts of violence. And at this time, during the next 30 or so minutes, we're going to talk about specifically emotional abuse. Emotional abuse, which goes by different names, but we'll talk about this in a few minutes. And as we come to a culminating point of our day, if you notice, my talk is entitled Silent No More. We've heard about different things that happen that are not happy, that are not good, that are sad, that are destructive, but we don't have to take it forever. We can do something about it. Now, one of the things that we want to make sure that you're aware of is that we do have resources. Right outside this door when you leave, right out there is a table with lots of information from our counseling center and from other departments here on campus, with pamphlets and educational pieces and things of that nature. In addition to that, we have some buttons that we would like to make sure that each one of you who may have experienced abuse in any way, or who may know someone who's experienced abuse in any way, that you take one of these buttons to remind yourselves of who you are. Now, when it comes to our discussion this morning and towards the afternoon, it will be meant to recapture our hearts and help us to engage in a journey of healing beyond emotional abuse. Our focus will be to look at emotional abuse, which is often overt but can be subtle, yet pervasive, and it impacts the lives of millions of people. And we're going to focus on identifying the most common types of emotional abuse, recognizing the signs of emotional abuse, and outlining some steps so that we can recapture our hearts, we can rediscover our self-esteem, we can embrace our status as precious children of the God of the universe, fearfully and wonderfully made in his image. And I'm going to keep emphasizing that. One of my favorite passages in the Bible is David's Psalm 139, verses 13 and 14. Now, I'd like you to read it with me because it's right there. And as you read it, try to just believe and embrace it. Let's start. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. Thank you. When you talk about knowing something, it means that you have a conviction, you have an awareness, and you know that you were fearfully and wonderfully made. And I want to make sure that this is used as a backdrop to what we're going to keep talking about. Because as we engage in this journey, that will bring some, for some of us, difficult memories. It's important to remember this, to remember that in spite of what we've gone through, in spite of what your history or your story may have been, you were created by the God of the universe. You are fearfully and wonderfully made, and God's work is always good, and you know that fully well. And it's also important to remember that because I'm reminded of Solomon's statement in Proverbs 23, verse 7, that says, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. And I'm going to say, as a woman thinketh in her heart, so is she. So as you embrace these terms, as you embrace these thoughts about yourselves and these beliefs about yourself, then you will certainly become those things. Now let's take a look at the definition of emotional abuse. Okay? 48% of men have experienced at least one psychological aggressive behavior by an intimate partner. That's 48% of women. But take a look at it. It's also 48.8% of men. So this is not, as it was said earlier, this is not just the men's problem, especially when it comes to emotional abuse. It's not just a women's problem. It is a problem that is pervasive. 4 in 10 women and 4 in 10 men have experienced at least one form of coercive control by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And about 17.9% of women have experienced a situation where an intimate partner tried to keep them from seeing family and friends. So again, let's remember here that we're not talking about one gender having an issue, because we're looking at the fact that individuals pretty much are the product of not just their DNA, but their developmental years. And if they grow up in situations where there was abuse, it's very likely that unless there's a transformation that takes place, that they will become perpetrators. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence puts out a whole lot of numbers, and here are some that you may want to be aware of. 18.7% of women have experienced threats of physical harm by an intimate partner. And look at the next one, 95% of men who physically abuse their intimate partners also psychologically abuse them. So when we think about emotional abuse, it occurs by itself. It occurs concurrently with all the other types of abuse. And so that's one of the reasons for which we realize that emotional abuse is pervasive. It's all over. So women also who earn 65% or more of their household incomes are more likely to be psychologically abused than women who earn less than 65% of their household incomes. And some people ask why. Well, it may be because of this control issue. We do know that when it comes to emotional abuse or any other type of abuse, then one of those basic, fundamental pillars happens to be control, coercion, wanting to make sure that one has power. The CDC comes out with several studies, and one of their largest studies took place in 2010. There was a survey that went from 2010 to 2012, and the report came out in 2017. And again, if you look at those numbers, their numbers included about 47.1% of US women during their lifetime experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner. And out of those 47.1%, 39.3% experienced expressive aggression, and 39.7% experienced coercive control. And again, expressive aggression has to do with yelling and belittling and throwing words at others or someone else or the abused. And the coercive control has to do specifically with the manipulation and the power struggle between the abuser and the abused. Also, their numbers show similar numbers for men. 47.3% of men during their lifetime experience psychological aggression, with 31.1% experiencing expressive aggression and 41% experiencing coercive control. So again, we look at similar numbers, about almost half and half of men and women. That particular study included all of the states in this country. And across the states, the numbers range from 36.6% to 57.2% of women experiencing psychological aggression by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And across all the states, if you look at the numbers, 29% to 56% of men experience psychological aggression by an intimate partner in their lifetime. This was a huge survey which included several thousands of people across all of the states. A more recent survey, which took place in 2015, also by the CDC, but that was much smaller. They removed a lot of questions on emotional abuse. They didn't do all of the across the states studies, and that one produced different numbers that were smaller, but you're going to see some similarities here as well. In that particular study, which is most recent, this report came out just last year in 2018. 36.4% of US women experienced psychological aggression during their lifetime, and 34.2% of men during their lifetime as well. But if you notice something, the numbers, again, are still similar. In other words, we're looking at instances where both men and women are being abusers or abused when it comes to emotional abuse. And it's not just impacting the adult population. A 2013 study of 10th graders found that 35% had been either physically or verbally abused. 31% were perpetrators of physical or verbal abuse. So emotional abuse is happening all the way down to the younger years as well. And a 2013 study also found 26% of teens in relationships were victims of cyber dating abuse. And some of us have, of course, all of us have heard about cyberbullying. We want to make sure that we understand that this is all part of the abuse cycle. This is all part of the abuse concept. So, for example, when it comes to bullying, we're talking about primarily youth who are not siblings, and that's the definition that the CDC brings us, involving an observed or perceived power imbalance. And bullying may inflict harm or distress on the targeted youth, including physical, psychological, social, or educational harm. And of course, as we know, when it comes to cyberbullying, we're looking at using or the use of technological devices and mechanisms such as email and texting and website and things of that nature. Now, it's important to note that emotional abuse involves behavior that controls. It controls where you go, to whom you talk, what you think. It includes direct or indirect behaviors that's derogatory, controlling, and punitive. The abuser uses manipulative means to withhold love, to withhold communication, support, or money, and to maintain power. So we're looking at controlling, manipulations, and power seeking. As we mentioned a few minutes ago, emotional abuse can be overt, can be right there in your face and you can experience it, but quite often it's also covert. And it causes long-term damage that may not initially show in the victim. Whether it's indirect or direct, it may not leave visible scars to mark its impact, but its wounds destroy the core self, and it often takes decades to surface. I work with college-age students here in this university, and in the community, I work with community individuals. And there are times when it's not until people are coming into their middle years that they no longer find a need to repress, or they can no longer repress. And they're able to determine that all of their behaviors and all of their difficulties had quite a bit to do with a number of issues, including the abuse that they experienced in their lives. Verbal abuse can take the form of loud, insulting shouts, but it can also be filtered through loving, quiet voices, or even concealed in a joke, a tease, sarcasm, or play. But regardless of how it is, it's important for you to be able to determine and to know what it is destructive. The abuser often shows affection in public, and you've had some presentations earlier this morning where it talk about the psychopathic type of traits and also the narcissistic traits, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But in private, the abuser manipulates situations specifically to cause pain and humiliation to his or her victim. Sometimes the manipulation can be so subtle that only the abused receives the impact, while others may not even be aware of the destruction happening right in front of them. That's why quite often abused individuals don't even want to talk about it because people may not believe them. And as a result of that, they continue to keep it all inside. Now let's take a look at, and we're going to take a look at several types of abuse, or how can you determine whether it's an abuse or not. Remember that not every time somebody yells, not every time that somebody says something that's demeaning to you, that it is a pattern of abuse. In a relationship, if someone is upset, then sometimes people are not to be in a place where they talk about you in ways that are disrespectful. But when we talk about abuse here, we're looking at patterns of behaviors, patterns that are very clear, that are very distinct. One of those has to do with rejecting. This is when your partner or a parent consistently uses harsh criticism, demeaning jokes, name-calling, teasing, about your appearance or your ability. The abused feels rejected when attempting to develop opinions of his or her own, or when those opinions do not agree with the abuser. This is rejecting. Another one is undermining or belittling. Sometimes the abuser may finish your sentences while you're talking. They're saying whatever it is that they want the sentence, how they want the sentence to go through, and they'll just finish it. Or they'll speak on your behalf without your permission. In other words, they're saying, you don't matter. This is a power control. Sometimes it can be in the form of ignoring, failure to connect or engage emotionally, consistently not acknowledging you as who you are or what you do. In essence, dismissing you. You don't count. I count. I am the one. This is, again, a power struggle. Opposing. Sometimes the abuser may just argue against anything you say, saying no to everything, and it becomes part of the conversation. And it is where whatever you say, this person goes the opposite way. Regardless of whether you know it's true or not, you have no way of ever getting a word in. And sometimes, in addition to that, there is threatening, blaming, and shaming, cursing, using verbal threats to harm or to reveal personal or embarrassing information about you. Making the person do or making you do something that you don't want to do in order to prove your love to that person. Just yesterday evening, as I walked through the photo exhibit in Harrigan, if you haven't gone there, it's important for you to go there before the end of the weekend and to look at stories and to read stories of survival. But it also was heart-wrenching to read some of these stories where individuals were forced to do things that they did not want to do. But because they felt that they had no recourse, they had no option, they did it. And so the abuser continued to coerce and to exercise control. Another way is to isolating, and that's one of the very typical ones. This is where the abuser continues and continuously forces seclusion, keeping you from your friends, keeping you from family support, being excessively possessive, and most of the time it's in the name of love. I love you. I don't want anybody else to have you. You're here with me and with me alone. And when you're trying to talk, when you're trying to use your telephone, when you're trying to reach out to other people, the answer is typically no. Earlier, someone mentioned this before about the denying or the gaslighting. And most of you may be aware of the fact that this is not a new term. It goes back to the 40s. With the movie Gaslighting, where a husband began to engage in behaviors to literally let his wife believe that something was wrong with her. In essence, when an abuser is denying, this abuser sometimes may say, well, I never said that. I don't know what you're talking about. And it makes the abused person just second guess him or herself, or second guess his or her own reality. And it makes you feel like you're losing your mind or memory. And there are instances when people come to a place where they say, I need counseling. Something's wrong with me. I really thought this was this way, but it isn't this way. And after you've gone through this and you've experienced it for day in and day out and this week, and most of the times abusers don't even try to get help until years later. Just imagine going through this for years and years and years. Sometimes your abuser may say, well, you're crazy, or you're oversensitive, or describe an event completely different from how you remember it. What it does is it makes you begin to doubt yourself to the point where eventually this person's belief system is what you embrace. Yours no longer counts. Withholding. It includes refusing to listen, refusing to communicate, and emotionally withdrawing as punishment. And this is sometimes called the silent treatment. And sometimes you think, well, something's wrong with me. They're not talking to me. What did I do that was wrong? In essence, you may not have done anything that was wrong. It's just that the abuser uses this as a way to manipulate and to have this power over you. Abandoning, refusing or withholding love, affection, or attention. Also blocking, switching topics when you speak. In effect saying, shut up, you don't count. Another one is minimizing. Again, there are times when it's denying, and other times it's minimizing. This is where the abuser is not necessarily denying that something takes place, but minimizes it. Saying, for example, you're too sensitive, you're exaggerating, you're blowing this out of proportion, all suggesting that the recipient's emotions and perceptions are faulty and not to be trusted. Another word for this is trivializing as well. When the abuser suggests that what you have done or communicated is inconsequential or unimportant. In other words, the message is clear. Your feelings don't matter. Now remember I mentioned a few minutes ago when we started to keep that verse, you are fearfully and wonderfully made by the God of the universe. And here's someone telling you, someone that you may have just met for 6 months or 2 months or 1 week, or you may have been married to for 10 years, or you may have had a relationship with, or maybe a parent telling you, created in God's image, that your feelings don't matter. You don't matter. There are a couple more complex types of emotional abuse, and I want to talk about 2 of those. Emotional abuse of enmeshment. This is where there's no place for a closed door for privacy for individual thoughts. The family is expected to be one enormous entity with no boundaries separating one from the other. It's pretty much words such as groupthink. But it's not where you are part of this system, it's where you are part of a unit where people are in charge. The abusive parents, the abusive caretakers, or anyone with a position of authority. In other words, still, your feelings don't matter. You can't think for yourself. You have no healthy boundaries. You have no boundaries at all because everything is part of this group. And this is the emotional abuse of enmeshment. And the other one is quite popular, frequently seen in lots of families. An emotional abuse of extreme overprotection and overindulgence. This leaves the abused, regardless of their academic or professional accomplishments, to believe that they cannot handle their work or their world sufficiently, and that no one can ever be allowed to become as important to them or help them as much as their parents or the abuser. In this case, you have rescuing parents who are constantly coming in, making decisions for the child, constantly coming in, problem solving for the teenager, constantly coming in and making decisions for the young adult, to the point where this individual, who was literally created to have free will, who was created by the God of the universe to become an autonomous individual, can no longer or has never learned to function on his or her own, and now has to depend on somebody else for the rest of his or her life, if that were to happen according to what the abuser wants. And this is the reason for which many children born in these home settings end up seeking people with those abusive traits because they feel, I can't do this by myself. I need somebody else. And so it's denying the fact that we were created in the image of a God who is all-knowing, all-powerful, and who calls us to be like him. The narcissistic or abuser. Now, we're told that our abusers are thought to have been raised in emotionally abusive environments. Lots of studies are showing that. And they learn to be abusive as a way to cope with their own feelings of insecurity, their own feelings of powerlessness, their own feelings of hurt, fear, and anger. Abusers tend to struggle with traits of narcissism, and it goes on a spectrum. Now, a psychologist by the name of Jean King wrote a book on the narcissistic abuse in intimate relationships, and there are lots of materials, documents out there on that. And I want to pull out a few of those traits for the narcissistic person. They have no empathy. They can't feel. They haven't learned to feel. Or they have chosen it. They've gotten to a place where they no longer feel. There's no remorse. There's a feeling of entitlement. There are behaviors of deception. And there are contradictory traits. This person, in one point, may show love and affection and care, and on the other hand, they're literally manipulating you and letting you know that you're the worst human being on the face of the earth. Technically, they're emotionally dependent. They can't survive without the abused. In essence, if this abused person eventually walks away or leaves, they're going to look for another one, and another one, and another one, because they have not learned. This is the reason for which, as someone mentioned a few minutes earlier, that 2-3 sessions or brief sessions of counseling will not effectively produce the transformation that is needed. So if an abuser comes to you and says, well, I've changed and I've been working at this for 6 months or for 3 months or even for a year for that matter, even for that 2 years for that matter, or for any extended amount of time, the words don't matter. You have to be able to look at the behavior. God can transform, but we have the power of choice, and we have to want to change for God to come in and to do those works within us. The cycle of abuse is very typical for the emotional abuser, as it is with most other abuses. There's a honeymoon period, usually starts. Well, everything's okay, and lots of gifts and lots of positive shows of affection. And there's a tension-building moment where somehow, after many years of going through this, the abused may not even know what to do or how to proceed. And then we move on to an explosive moment. And this explosion, this is where the emotional abuse usually takes place. And most of us, we refer to this as an acute phase. Now, typically there's a reaction from the abused, all right? And someone identified 4 types of reactions. They're all Fs. There's either a fight back. The abused person tries to fight back and throws words back and so forth. This is very common. Or there's a flight. It can be a physical flight. They're running away and being afraid. Or it can be a symbolic one, launching into hyperactivity. They're moving and doing something else, while this barrage of just accusations keep flowing into their lives. There's also the possibility of a freeze. This response is triggered when a person, realizing that resistance is futile, they give up, they numb. Many times they dissociate, okay? Now, when that happens, the word that we usually see that people say, well, they split. I can't take this anymore, so I'm going to turn it into something else. I'm going to literally reverse or open up my mind into another space so that I don't have to take this. And the last one is the fawn reaction. This is where this person tries to appease, tries to do something nice to see if they can help the abuser to de-escalate. These are all reactions. Reactions do not help when it comes to change. 7 out of 10 psychologically abused women display symptoms of PTSD or depression, and many of them move on to having suicidal ideation and suicidal intent, or attempts, as a matter of fact. Women experiencing psychological abuse are significantly more likely to report 4 physical and mental health, and to have more than 5 physician visits in the last year. There have been several studies that have showed that people that, we're not talking about physical violence here, this is emotional abuse. These individuals tend to have more physical ailments than the person who has not been abused. And so they're seeking help for medical conditions that may not seem to have anything to do with the abuse, but that may have been triggered by the emotional abuse. Psychological abuse is a strong predictor of PTSD, and it is stronger than physical abuse among women. This is from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So, when we look at this, how can we get out of it? How do we find restoration? How do we find healing? First of all, it involves understanding what abusive relationship looks like and feels like. This is a good forum for this, where you're learning, you're listening, you're connecting with people, and understanding all of the different nuances of psychological aggression or emotional abuse. Accepting the life story into which you were born and knowing that it does not define you. You had nothing to do with the family into which you were born. You just came. And if that family was already hurting and was already in a distorted place, then you grew up in that family structure, but it does not necessarily state who you are. Having the courage to not only look at that life story, but also to rewrite a present and future story that affirms a sense of dignity denied you in your childhood or in your abusive relationship. And it also involves reaching out to a supportive network of family and friends. Quite often, as we said earlier, when people are experiencing abuse, they tend to feel so much shame, so much guilt, that they just keep it all to themselves and they don't feel that anybody can understand them. And if they are in a relationship with someone who tends to be very outgoing and who has lots of friends, definitely they're not going to talk about it. However, you don't have to be silent anymore. Seek support and education to identify the many subtle ways in which you have been abused. Identify the behaviors that are meant to control and demean you and make you feel less than the fearfully and wonderfully made person created in God's image. Seek help in cultivating the courage to respond to the abuse assertively and intentionally, and not necessarily react. Learn to establish healthy boundaries. Write down what you may need to say. Sometimes it may not be possible at that moment when you realize that you're being abused to walk away from the relationship. You may have children in that relationship and you need to plan financially with the children. What are you going to do? But you don't have to take the abuse while you're planning or while you're working through finding a solution. And most of the time, because the abuser has already established power over you, it may be hard for you to try to stand up against this abuser who has taken all of your power and say something to him or to her. So write it down. Write down what you may need to say in response to psychological aggression and practice it over and over and over again. Become a broken record if needs be, assertively stating that you will no longer tolerate that. You don't even have to have an excuse or reason. I will not tolerate this behavior. Stay connected with your support, because by yourself, it may be almost impossible to do this. Stay connected with your support to keep your courage and maintain your boundaries. Learn to disengage from an emotionally abusive interchange, walking away if needs be. Learn to accept that you cannot change the abuser. It's not your job to change him anyway. Only God can. And this abuser has the freedom of choice. Transformation does not happen overnight, because you know what? A lot of everything that we do has to do with this brain right here, this beautiful mechanism that we have. And there are neural pathways. You've heard about the plasticity of the brain. And over time, people's habits become entrenched in that brain. It doesn't disappear all of a sudden. It takes time. It takes work. It takes a will. And so you have to learn to accept that you cannot change this abuser. But you know what? You can change your response. That you can do. And over time, that response will become entrenched in your brain as well. Seek help in cultivating the courage to respond to the abuse assertively and intentionally. Don't rely on your emotions, because you may not be able to, at that point in time, you may be so broken that you can't rely on those emotions. You've got to look into where God has placed that logical part of your brain that says something is wrong. It's not right. I was fearfully and wonderfully made by the God of the universe, and no one can take that away from me. Be open to accessing counseling resources and to seek help. You're not alone. There are lots of people who've gone through that path and who've overcome, and there are lots more who will do the same. If the abuse continues, cultivate the courage to maintain your healthy boundaries, and that could limit your interaction with the abuser or getting you to a place where there is no contact with the abuser. Someone wrote the basic rights in a relationship. I want to make sure that you're aware of that, and some of you may be familiar with that statement. It's, you have the right as an individual to goodwill from the other person. You have the right to emotional support. You have the right to be heard by the other and to be responded to with courtesy. I said courtesy. You have the right to have your own opinion, even if your partner has a different view. You have the right to have your own feelings and experience knowledge as real. You have the right to receive a sincere apology for any jokes or comments you may find offensive. You have the right to clear and informative answers to questions that concern what is legitimately your business as an adult, as a human. You have the right to live free from accusation and blame. You have the right to be free from criticism and judgment. You have the right to have your work and your interests spoken of with respect. You have the right to encouragement. You have the right to live free from emotional and physical threat, and the right to live free from angry outbursts and rage. The right to be called by no name that devalues you. The right to be respectfully asked rather than ordered. What can we do as a community? Or what can we do at the organizational level? A few things. We can, as a community, promote social norms, protecting against violence. A lot has been done, but we need to do a whole lot more. We can put in place policies to more effectively educate and protect. Education is key. Educate on developing healthy relationship management skills, starting at a very young age. We don't have to wait until we're adults to learn how to do that. If we're parents, if we're teachers, if we have younger siblings or family members or friends, help them to develop healthy relationship management skills. Teach conflict resolution, anger management skills at an early age, and train children, teens, and young adults to become empowered individuals. Promote an I am loved movement. Teach individuals from the early years through teens, through their adult years, through their golden years, to embrace their mind and their body and their soul as what? Precious, special, unique, valued, of worth, brave, endowed, strong, resilient, priceless, treasured, esteemed, worthy of respect, cherished. Winnie the Pooh said this to his best friend. You're braver than you believe. You're stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think. Don't let anybody fool you in thinking otherwise, because you were created to thrive. You were created to soar. You are daughters and sons of the God of the universe. Another of my favorite verses is in Isaiah chapter 49, verse 16. Behold, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. Your walls are continually before me. I am precious. God has made each one of us precious. God has made each one of us esteemed daughters and sons of the God of the universe. And there's no one who can take that away from us. Just before I leave, I just want to remind you that we do have a table outside. And here are the buttons that we have. It says, I am. And there are lots of different traits or adjectives that you may choose to remind you that you are precious in God's sight. And mine is, I am wholesome. I want to remind myself of this every single day. And if you choose any of the other buttons, you want to remind yourself, not just today, but tomorrow and the day after and the week after and the year after, that you were fearfully and wonderfully made, and no one has the right to take that away from you. So the table is right out there on your way out. In a few minutes, you'll be dismissed. Get a button, wear it, remind yourself, remember that as a man or a woman thinketh in her heart or in his heart, so is he or so is she. And we want to fully embrace the gift that God has given to each one of us, that of being sons and daughters of the God of the universe. Thank you.